So good evening. Let's go to the question paper analysis of UGC Net English, December 21, shift 1. And this analysis is presented by Professor Academy, Chennai. And today we are going to look at questions from 61 to 65. 61. Which of the following clusters is associated with what Julia Kristeva terms the semiotic? Option A, authority, order, and patriarchy. B, displacement, slippage, and condensation. C, logic, reason, and power. D, repression, control, and normalcy. So it's a bit tough question. And first, I can give you a few clues. Julia Kristeva is a feminist, psychoanalyst, and also a linguist. And when you say semiotic, this semiotic is different from the established one. So this is her own coinage, and she means something else. Okay. And the only clue I can give for you to choose the answer is that something, some of these clusters are associated with psychoanalysis, especially Freud. So if you can get the terms associated with Sigmund Freud and his idea of psychoanalysis, then that's the answer. So let's go to the answer. B, displacement, slippage, and condensation. The term displacement and condensation both are associated with Sigmund Freud's analysis of dreams. But let's check out this question and also the reason behind this answer. Julia Kristeva was a linguist, psychoanalyst, and also a feminist. And she came up with this term called semiotic, S-E-M-I-O-T-I-C. But earlier, there was a term called the semiotic, right? That semiotic is different from this semiotic. That semiotic refers to semiotics. That's a field of study referring to the study of science, S-I-G-N-S, more associated with American logician and mathematician Peirce, right? But this semiotic is different. So this is one of the modes of the signifying process, according to Julia Kristeva. So before we can understand semiotic, let's look at the term the symbolic. The symbolic is associated with the French psychoanalyst Lacan. According to Lacan, a child enters this symbolic stage, which is equivalent to a child's entry into the mirror stage. What happens in this mirror stage? A child looks at itself in the mirror, and when it looks at itself in the mirror, it recognizes that it is different from its mother. So earlier, the child assumed that it looked like the mother. It was part of the mother's body. But here, the child is looking at itself in the mirror. Then it recognizes itself in the mirror. Then it says to itself, okay, I'm different from mother. And this differentiation, this idea of a child recognizing itself or distinguishing itself from the mother is actually the entry point of a child's stepping into the language, the system of language. So simply put, Lacan's mirror stage or the symbolic is a stage in which a child enters the system of language, where it recognizes differences between language items, right? So how we differentiate the cat is different from the dog. This is how language functions. You differentiate things, right? Language is a system of differences. So this is the idea by Lacan, the symbolic. And Julia Kristeva says, before this stage, the symbolic stage, we have the semiotic. So in this stage, the child is more associated with its instincts. So this is the stage associated with the feminine or the female. So this is the stage before the linguistic mode. So the pre-linguistic mode, it has nothing to do with language, right? So it has more to do with instincts, basic instincts, or it is a child is driven by its instincts rather than this entry into language. So this is the stage which is also associated with the feminine. So if you want to read more about this, you can consult Julia Kristeva's celebrated work, desire in language, a semiotic approach to literature and art. Right now, let's elaborate on this. So, simply put, from this, what we get, Julia Kristeva gave a new definition to the semiotic, referring to the pre-linguistic mode and how a child is driven by its instincts. Now, from this, let's go back to Jacques Lacan. So, this psychoanalyst extended the terms given by Sigmund Freud. So, according to Sigmund Freud, when we dream, we get images, right, in our dreams. So, those images are not straightforward. Either they are condensed or displaced. So, these are the terms used by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud says, the images in our dream is either condensed, in the sense two or more images are compressed together, are condensed together, right, into a single image. So in our dreams, if you see one image, it is actually a layer of dreams, right? So that is one, condensation. Displacement, image is not a straightforward one. Instead of one image, another image takes its place. So one image displaces another image. It's an indirect way of conveying something. So this is Sigmund Freud's idea, condensation and displacement. Then there is another critic we have, Russian formalist, Roman Jakobson. So Roman Jakobson talked about the two axes of language. When you analyze language, we either go for metaphor or metonymy. We use either metaphor or metonymy. What is metaphor? Metaphor is an implicit comparison, right? So it's not direct. You imply certain things by comparing something. For instance, when we say the baby is like a rose, that's a simile. When we say the baby is a rose, it is not a direct comparison. It's an indirect comparison. What is implied? The baby is beautiful, tender, and young. We imply a lot of things. So this is metaphor. Metonymy is more to do with associated meanings, right? And something about the history and analysis. For instance, when we say the crown is symbolic. It has some historical meaning. It says the crown symbolizes power, authority, king, and a lot of other things. So Lacan, compares or equates Sigmund Freud's idea of a condensation to Roman Jakobson's metaphor. Then he compares displacement, Freud's displacement, with Jakobson's metonymy, right? Then he made a beautiful statement. Lacan said, the unconscious mind is structured like a language. So whatever we see, or our repressed desires, or the language in our mind, the unconscious is structured more like a language, this condensation and displacement. And these two terms are relevant to the analysis of literature, or the images we come across in literature. So this is Lacan's contribution, but he borrowed the terms from Sigmund Freud and Roman Jakobson. So simply put, think the unconscious mind is structured like a language. From here, we come to Julia Kristeva. So Julia Kristeva, earlier, she gave a new meaning to the semiotic. Then when we say semiotic, it includes condensation, displacement, and she came up with this term, metonymic slippage. What is metonymic slippage? You can't say all the images are either metaphor or between the continuum. I mean, in the continuum, you can say on the one hand metaphor, on the other hand you have metonymy. Sometimes there are slippages or slippage, and she talks about that, metonymic slippage. So you can't say these are the only two ideas, or there is, as if there is nothing between them. So she comes up with a kind of a disturbance. She disturbs the established thought. She calls that metonymic slippage of desire and of the signifier governing desire. And she coined this term in this book, Revolution in Poetic Language. So with this, let's go to the next question. Who among the following played the most significant role in mobilizing the concept of cultural intermediaries? Option A, Karl Marx. B, Louis Althusser. C, Pierre Bourdieu. D, Jürgen Habermas. So we'll go to the answer. And the clue, someone associated with cultural studies. So if you have some introduction to cultural studies, you can eliminate two options here. Here, two people are associated with more Marxism. Of course, you can eliminate Marxism. And there's another guy who is also, another critic is also associated with Marxism. Then we have two other critics who are more associated with cultural studies. So you can choose. And we have also discussed this critic in one of the earlier questions. Answer C, Pierre Bourdieu. So Pierre Bourdieu, one of the cultural critics, he came up with this term called the new cultural intermediaries, and this is the definition he gave in this in his well-known book, Distinction: A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. So in this book, Pierre Bourdieu describes or defines this term. The new cultural intermediaries refer to the most typical of whom are the producers of cultural programs. So these days we have cultural programs representing a particular culture, Tamil culture or Malayalam culture or Bengali culture. So when we go for that, no, immediately we go for these producers of cultural programs on TV, radio, or the critics of, within quotes, quality newspapers and magazines, and all the journalists and journalist writers. So this is how, intermediates, they intermediate, culture and us. All right. So this is how he defined cultural intermediates. So with this, we'll go to the next question. The following three questions are based on this passage from Harold Bloom's essay, The Use of Poetry. So let's spend some time reading this so that we can answer the next three questions. So let's start. What can be the use of a poetry that has no true subject except the poet's own selfhood? First, try to understand the question because it's significant. So these days in NET exam, you are given a passage from an essay, poetry, drama, novel. Then you are asked to interpret it on the spot. So you need not have read this essay before, but you should have some exposure to reading essays or interpretation, right? Let's read one more time. Without understanding the question, we can't understand the rest. What can be the use of poetry? Okay, so focus is on the use of poetry. That's also the title. That has no true subject. So if poetry doesn't have true subject, but instead of that, you have the poet's own selfhood. So what is the focus here? We have a kind of poetry which focuses more on the poet's own selfhood instead of some subject. Okay, that's the first question. So if a kind of poetry that focuses more on the poet's own selfhood, what can be its use? Okay, you rephrase this question. So after this question, Harold Bloom goes for an introduction. So he says, the traditional use of poetry in the Western world has been instruction through delight. So this is a major statement often people make, old critics, ancient critics. They say the use of poetry, what is the use of poetry? Poetry should teach and delight, right? So that is the use. Poetry should teach people about this world and also delight. They should derive joy, enjoyment from reading poetry. So that is a traditional use of poetry. And when we say teach, what is its meaning? Where teaching has meant the common truths or common deceptions of societal tradition. So when we say teaching, poetry should teach common truths, universal truths or common deceptions, right? Falsehood in society. So that's number one function of poetry. Earlier, right? So earlier in the sense, earlier critics said that poetry should teach, it should teach common truths or common deceptions. Number two, it should teach or it should give pleasure. And where aesthetic pleasure has meant a fulfillment of expectations founded upon past joys of the same design. So what is this pleasure? So how do we get pleasure from reading poetry? Because we expect certain things from poetry because we have a tradition. So if you're going to read a sonnet, so you expect that there should be some 14 lines. Or when we say poetry, in sonnet, It focuses more on one subject, generally love. So these are the expectations, right? When we know this is the pattern or design or poetic form. So we think of a poetic form or any artistic form, we have certain expectations. Like, you think of detective fiction. What are the expectations? Definitely there should be a murder, or there should be clues, there should be suspects, there should be a detective, and the detective should have certain skills. So if a particular work fulfills all these expectations and it goes beyond that, then we are happy, right? So these are the two basic functions, right? A traditional way, teaching and delighting. So it teaches you and teaches the common truths and delights you because it fulfills certain expectations. So these are the two uses. But so you have to note this key term. So there is a change in the argument. Harold Bloom says, so far, okay, but now, but an individual psyche has its own accidents. So in the sense, okay, that is tradition. What about individual talent? I hope you're reminded of the essay by T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Almost similar argument. That is tradition, but an individual writer can go against the tradition because that's how literature grows. Or it will be the same every decade or every century. But an individual psyche has its own accidents, which it needs to call truths. So if you are going to come up with something going against tradition, of course, you have something to contribute to the established tradition by breaking that tradition, right? And its own necessity for self-recognition. And of course, as an individual writer, you need some recognition. You have to establish yourself. At any field, there is a tradition. You have to show that you are different from that one. But at the same time, you follow and you go beyond that. So how to attain this self-recognition, which requires the pleasures of originality. So you have to be original. You can't imitate. So if you're an actor, especially in Tamil, so you can't say, I'm going to imitate Rajini or Kamal. So you have to establish yourself with something different, right? So you can't just base your acting on the established actors, something original. Even if those pleasures depend upon a kind of lying against time. So sometimes, in order to show your originality, you have to break a lot of things. You need not be, always portraying truth. Sometimes a kind of lying or against time. Why this lying? Even people always go after truths. Sometimes they forget to learn the art of lying and the deceptions there, and against the achievements of the past. So in order to show originality and achieve self-recognition, sometimes you have to go against the past tradition and also against the truth, common truths. So you have to go different. Finally, Harold Bloom concludes, the use of such poetry, it refers to the beginning statement, the opening statement. Such poetry refers to poetry whose subject is the poet's own selfhood. So that kind of poetry demands to be seen in a de-idealized way. So you need a separate way of criticizing this one, de-idealized way. Come out of this traditional way and look at it in a different way, if it is to be seen more truly. So if you want to really judge, this original writing which seeks for self-recognition, going against tradition, so you have to see in a different way. So we have read this, but it needs time. You can't, I don't think you can come up with this kind of an understanding initially. It takes years of reading. So what you can do, always spend some time on reading original text. Take any essay for that matter. Why don't you read Wordsworth preface or any other essay? So if you cultivate this habit of reading, definitely you can tackle these kinds of questions. Let's go to the answer. Questions, 3 questions based on this passage. Then you will know the difference. Okay. Question number 63. What is meant by traditional use of poetry? Right. So this is a question based on the passage given. Option A, promoting doubtful pleasure. B, promoting joyous expectations. C, promoting serious ideas. D, promoting social honesty in life. So what is the traditional use? Traditional use, we saw 2, right? And what is that? Answer is, it is almost a direct question, right? B, promoting joyous expectations, right? To teach and delight. So how do we derive pleasure? by expecting, or that a particular piece of work fulfills certain expectations, established expectations, or simply put, literary norms or forms, right? So this is, once you read again and again, this is a straightforward question. Next one, in the context of the above, which is closest to being true? Okay. Option A, there can be no use of poetry. Did Harold Bloom say this? There can be no use of poetry. B, man may be the true subject of poetry. C, poetry can have no true subject. D, the poet himself may be the subject. So what you can do, sometimes if you read this question, you can actually go back to the passage and read one more time. Do you think there's no use of poetry? I don't think Harold Bloom said that. Or poetry can have no true subject. Or man may be the true subject, or the poet himself may be the true subject. If you just read the opening line of that passage, and the answer is straightforward. The poet himself may be the true subject. Okay. Then the last question of today's analysis. If selfhood of a poet is the subject of poetry, ironically, the question setter himself or herself has given the answer in the next. The selfhood of a poet is a subject of poetry. And this is associated, this confirms our answer, earlier one, in 64. The poet himself may be the subject. Okay, fine. So the question setter has confirmed that that is the answer. If selfhood of a poet is a subject of poetry, then originality shall spring from. So originality come from option A, creating ideal pleasures. B, reliving the past joys. C, some truth of untruths. D, truth of self-recognition. We first eliminate options. It seems confusing. Number one, should a new poet, one who wants to show his or her originality, right, seeking self-recognition, should create ideal pleasures? There's nothing ideal, right? Then you should always go back to the past, reliving the past joys. It is not there. It should be either C or D, right? Because you can go against truth by lying. So some truth of untruth, that's what originality comes from, or truth of self-recognition. So between these two, we are confused. Or do you think, is there any way, truth of self-recognition, that kind of a phrase you came upon, that's different? Okay, the answer is actually C, some truth of untruth. So even in untruths, you can find truth. So that is where originality comes. You show the other way of seeing the same thing, right? So this is how you get questions these days. You will be given, in the following NET exams, passages from poetry, passages from novels, dramas, and also essays. So what you have to do, cultivate the habit of reading original text, original poetic lines. For novels, you need not bother. You at least read the entire detailed summary of particular novels so that you can tackle novels. But here you need some reading habit, or else these questions are tough to answer on the spot. And the essay, The Use of Poetry, was published in 1975 in New York Times. And it's a very short essay, around 2 pages, that's all. And this is one of the statements Harold Bloom made in this essay. Poetry teaches a reader the necessity of interpretation. All right. So that's what I think UGC NET, UGC also believes in. A student of literature should cultivate or develop the habit of, interpreting texts on their own. Or so this is a statement. Poetry teaches a reader the necessity of interpretation. And what is interpretation? And interpretation is, to cite the other great philosopher of modern poetry, Nietzsche. Nietzsche has defined interpretation as follows: the exercise of the will to power over a text. So you are given a text. You have to show your will over the text. It's like proclaiming the death of the author, and you have to show that you have a will of your own and you can interpret that text. Okay. So with this, let's finish today's class. Before that, when we think of Harold Bloom, critic, post-structuralist, or deconstructionist, when we think of Harold Bloom, the first book that comes to our mind is The Anxiety of Influence. which is his contribution to literary criticism. When we say the anxiety of influence, it talks about, again, this book is associated with the essay we discussed today, the use of poetry. So any new poet suffers from this anxiety, a kind of a fear. What is that fear? That you may not be so original, right? So you think, if you are going to be a director and you are afraid that, will I be different from the established directors? Or if you're going to be a novelist, so you want to say something, but you are afraid that people have already said a lot of things. So initially you suffer from this anxiety of influence. People will simply say, this writer is influenced by that writer, the past writer. So you don't want that blame. So you suffer from this anxiety. So because of this anxiety, what you have to do, you have to kill the father, a kind of Oedipal complex. You have to kill the father, your influence. Then you have to show your originality. So you can connect this essay or this book with that essay, The Use of Poetry by Harold Bloom, the anxiety of influence. But later, feminist critics blasted this work because this is more to do with, they said, this is more to do with male writers, not female writers. So that was their argument, right? The anxiety of influence, more a male tradition, how male writers are afraid of or suffers this anxiety of influence from male writers. They have a tradition. What about female writers who are going to establish a new tradition of writing, right? Then when we say Harold Bloom, this is considered his masterpiece, The Western Canon, subtitle, The Books and the Schools of the Ages. So this is considered a classic, and this is his major contribution. Next, what you can do, you can check out at least the contents page of these two books. Definitely you should look at the contents page of Harold Bloom's The Western Canon. And you can also read about post-structuralism, and or also called deconstruction. So with this, let's end today's class. Thank you so much. And you can subscribe to this channel for further updates, and you can contact this number on the screen to join the courses. Thank you so much.